People who quit their jobs on their first day. What made you say, I'm done? Story 1. My first day working at EB Games, I was so excited. The first half of my shift was just cleaning up the shelves, which was fine since it was a high-traffic store and things were always a mess. After 5 hours, I took my break. When I came back, my manager was standing in the middle of an empty store, completely stunned, staring at a huge, steaming pile of shit on the carpet. Apparently, a homeless guy had walked in, dropped his pants, and just let loose without saying a word. My manager turned to me and said, "Oh good, you're back, just in time. Clean that up, I'm going to lunch." I laughed in his face. "You can't be serious, I'm not touching that." His response, "It's your job, I expect it gone before I get back." I told him he could deal with it himself because I did not need this job that badly. I grabbed my coat and left. 1 week later, the district manager called me to apologize and offered me my job back. Story 2. I've worked construction my whole life, and the number of abusive, angry bosses I've dealt with is endless. But one guy still holds the title for worst. Back in the 90s, a friend quit his job and, without asking me first, gave my number to his horrible boss. One day, this guy called me out of nowhere and asked if I needed work. I said I did. He said he'd pick me up the next morning. I told him I had a car and could meet him on site. That set him off. He started yelling that he would pick me up. I was stunned. 2 minutes into our first conversation, and he was already shouting at me. But whatever. I gave him my address. He said he'd be there at 6:30 a.m. At 5:30 a.m., my phone rang. "Where is your house?" No hello, no good morning, just full-on screaming. I told him if he'd stop yelling, I could give him directions. He just kept yelling, so I hung up. He called right back, furious that I hung up on him. I told him to phone off and not bother coming. My 2 roommates, now awake and pissed at me, asked what was going on. I explained, and they just went back to bed. 30 minutes later, I was woken up by a car horn blaring outside. We lived on a farm, so thankfully the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. My roommates were up again, livid this time. We all went outside, and there he was, screaming at us to get in the truck because we were late. Mind you, he was half an hour early. He also had no clue who was who, because he had only spoken to me. I was about to tell him to, again, but my buddy walked up to his truck and said, "You gotta pay me up front." The guy lost his mind, screaming at him. My buddy just laughed and said, "If you're gonna be an inadequate person, you need to pay me first." The guy kept yelling. My buddy said, "Okay, I'll be right out. Have my money ready." We went back inside and just watched from the window. He sat in his truck for 5 minutes, then started honking again. We peeked out and told him we'd be there in a minute. He kept honking. We ignored him. After another 10 minutes, he came banging on the door. When I opened it, I was stunned. He was about 200 pounds. He was about to say something, but I cut him off. "Didn't I tell you to not bother coming here?" He looked confused. "Where's the other guy?" I laughed. "Oh, he was just messing with you. I'm the guy you were talking to." He stared at me. "So you're really gonna fucker me over and not come to work?" I couldn't believe this guy. "Sure, if you pay me up front." Cue more screaming. I slammed the door in his face. He kept banging on it. I'd had enough. I grabbed a hockey stick and chased him back to his truck. Watching him run was hilarious. As he backed out of the driveway, he shouted, "You'll regret this. I'll get you for this." Story 3. I technically quit before my first day. I got hired at a well-known gift store under the agreement that I'd work Saturdays and Sundays, just 2 4-hour shifts for a total of 8 hours a week, minimum wage. No problem. I'd done that before and planned to pick up a second job during the week. Apparently that wasn't allowed. The manager was horrified that I would consider working anywhere else and called it disrespectful. She told me I should learn to manage my money better if I couldn't survive on $64 a week before taxes. Yeah, I didn't show up. She called, furious that I would pass up such an opportunity. Story 4. My first job was at a little drive-in restaurant near my high school. On my first day, the owner told me I had to pay her $50 for training. Then she walked me through the place and explained that I'd be making $5 an hour as a car hop. This was in 2010. All tips went into a shared bucket with the other girls. At the end of the night, she counted up the tips, took 20% for herself, then split the rest among all employees, not just the ones who earned them. Oh, and once a week, part of the job included spending 4 hours cleaning her house. I walked out right then and there. My dad was furious until another girl confirmed everything I told him. Then he agreed I made the right call. Story 5. I didn't quit, but I should have. Years ago, I went in for an admin assistant interview. The place was in the back of a strip mall. Small parking lot, forest behind it. As soon as I sat down, the guy told me it wasn't actually an admin position. It was a cold calling job for alarm systems. I knew immediately this was a waste of time, but I played along. Then it got worse. He said, I'd be working a lot of evenings, just the 2 of us in the office. Yeah, no thanks. Then he added that he loved rewarding his team for good sales and always took them on trips to Mexico. Super sketchy. I walked out, told my boyfriend, now husband, there was no way I was taking that job, and ignored the second interview call when it came in. Story 6. I worked as a cashier at a cafeteria inside a large company. Employees would leave tips in a bucket, and since they made good money, there were often 10s and 20s in there. The manager refused to let me or any other cashiers take any of the tips. Her reason? She claimed cashiers couldn't be trusted with money. Instead, she said she sent all the tips to a church in El Paso. I immediately knew this was a scam and never went back. I'm pretty sure it's illegal to collect money under one pretense and then use it for something completely different without telling people. Story 7. For those who don't know, tip laws are pretty strict. Tips count as wages only for tipped employees. Employers can't take tips except for processing credit card fees. Tip pools cannot include non-tipped employees. Employers must inform employees in advance if they'll be paid less than minimum wage due to a tip credit. Working for tips only is illegal. And no, if you're in a tipped position, you're not an independent contractor. If your boss is messing with tips, chances are it's illegal. Story 8. Early in my career as a chef, I had an interview at a hotel for a kitchen position. The executive chef came across as arrogant, not unusual in the industry, so I didn't think much of it. The pay was decent, the shift was good, and I figured I'd take the job. As I was leaving, I turned toward the dining room, the way I had entered. The restaurant was closed at the time, with service starting in an hour. Then he stopped me. No, not that way. Go through the kitchen. You're not good enough to walk through the dining room. I was so stunned, I just complied without a word. Later that day, after thinking about it, I called him up and said, after taking a closer look, I've decided that your menu isn't good enough. I won't be accepting the offer. Story 9. My first internship was at a Brazilian teen detention center. In Brazil, there's a distinction between crimes committed by adults and teens, so instead of adult prisons, young offenders go through socio-educational measures. One day, I was walking through the courtyard with my supervisor when suddenly, doctors started running in one direction, flailing their arms and screaming, while officers ran from the opposite direction. My supervisor grabbed me and just said, "Run." Turns out some of the teens as young as 12 had escaped. A few minutes later, an officer pounded on our office door, yelling for everyone to evacuate, because the teens who hadn't escaped had set their mattresses on fire inside their cells. I didn't technically quit, but my university teacher did. She wasn't even there that day. The university forced me to pick a different place to intern. Oh well. Story 10. I got hired at an electronics store, and on my first day, we had to attend a class on upselling. They basically taught us to ignore what customers actually wanted and instead take advantage of their lack of knowledge about the products. It felt really shady. Then they introduced a commission-style bonus program that practically forced employees to push unnecessary add-ons and upgrades. When we broke for lunch, I walked out and never came back. Never got paid for those 4 hours, but I never once regretted leaving. Story 11. My wife worked at a law firm for about a week in college, along with a friend. One night, a senior partner asked them to stay late, then casually mentioned that he'd like to take them both on at the same time in the conference room. They immediately walked out and never went back. This was in the 90s when, unfortunately, that kind of harassment was all too common. Thankfully, she eventually found a great company to work for. Story 12. I interviewed for a professional marketing assistant job and got hired immediately. I assumed I'd be assisting the guy who interviewed me. The next day, I showed up for my first shift, and the waiting room was full of people. Turns out, we were all hired. The job? Door-to-door sales, peddling useless crap. I spent the entire day sitting in a Starbucks applying for other jobs. Got paid for the day, but never went back. Story 13. I got hired at a sandwich shop in college. Before my first day, I came down with the flu and let them know. They told me to come in anyway since it was just training. They had me making sandwiches, no gloves, runny nose, coughing everywhere. I left within an hour and never ate there again. Absolutely not. Story 14, I took a summer job working for a landscape architect. When I got to the job site, he told me to dig a hole in rocky soil. I asked for a shovel. He didn't have one. I asked for a hand spade. He didn't have one. Then he told me to dig it with my bare hands. And then he drove off, leaving me completely alone. I tried digging for a bit, then said, screw this, and left. If the job posting had said I needed my own tools, I would have brought them. But expecting someone to dig through rocky dirt with their hands? Absolutely not. Story 15. I interviewed for a part-time truck stocking job at UPS. The hours were perfect, 4 to 7 a.m. a few days a week, so I figured it'd be a good side gig. The moment I arrived, they told me having any other job or commitments was unacceptable because this was supposed to be my number one priority. I stood up and walked out mid-sentence while they were still giving the introduction. Story 16. I got hired at a gas station, but the manager told me I had to work for free until I learned their system to a satisfactory level. I agreed because I really needed a job. My first day, I showed up at 7 a.m., but the manager wasn't even there to train me. I just stood around trying to be helpful on the forecourt, but no one told me what I should actually be doing. I wasn't learning anything. After 90 minutes of waiting around with no training and no sign of the manager, I decided I wasn't going to be taken advantage of. I told the cashier to pass on the message that I quit and walked out. Story 17. Fresh out of college, young and naive, I took a marketing job. The interview seemed normal, no immediate red flags. First day, 4 hours of training. Then I found out what the job actually was, going door to door in suburban neighborhoods trying to sell cable to elderly people. We were required to dress in business attire, so I spent the entire day hiking around in my best suit, skirt, and heels. The hours were supposed to be 9 to 5, but we didn't get back to the office until well after 10 p.m. Then I saw the person I was shadowing make a sale to an older gentleman who clearly had memory issues. That was the final straw. I walked away and never looked back. Story 18. I got hired as a restaurant line chef. My first shift was 12 hours long. I got 2 breaks, 10-15 minutes each. They handed me scorching hot plates straight from the oven without a word, and I burned my hands over and over. At the end of my shift, I told the head chef I was done. He called me soft and said I was the 3rd person to quit after 1 day. I told him, maybe it's the way you treat people. Story 19. Worked 1 day at a hotel. No one told me where anything was. I got chewed out for not knowing. Guests literally told me to ignore my boss because she was a CNT. At the end of my shift, I told the manager I wouldn't be coming back. The next day, I went in to return my uniform. My supervisor saw me and immediately started yelling that I was late. I told her I already quit, but if I were working, technically, I was 5 hours early for my shift. Absolute nutcases. Story 20. I got a job as a salesman for Kirby Vacuums. The first sales call was to an elderly woman supporting her son in the hospital. We got in by offering a free carpet cleaning demonstration. My supervisor pushed hard for the sale, pressuring her until she was in tears. Just as she was about to sign, I asked if she actually wanted the vacuum. She admitted it was nice, but she couldn't afford it. I took the paperwork from her and told her not to worry. Outside, I told my supervisor I quit. His response? You would have been fired anyway. No love lost. I stuck around for half an hour playing on my phone just to make sure he actually left. He was a real piece of work. Story 21. It wasn't my first day, but I never showed up after my second shift. I got hired as a cook at a popular cafe chain in my country. It was supposed to be me and a senior cook working together in the kitchen. Let's ignore the fact that I had 0 cooking experience. The real problem? The senior cook left the kitchen every 5 minutes to smoke. Orders were piling up fast, and I was completely alone, standing there clueless while waitresses yelled at me to make food I had no business cooking, especially not by myself. Then later, the senior cook casually mentioned that there were at least 2 rats running around the kitchen. To prove it, he showed me rat poop on a plate. I never came back. The place eventually got shut down. Good riddance. Story 22. I noped out of a job interview once. Management-level employees were conducting the interview, and in the middle of it, they started arguing with each other. Right then and there, I decided, nope, not for me. At the end, I politely thanked them and said I wasn't interested. If management was already a disaster, I couldn't imagine what working there would be like. Story 23. Anytime I walk into a job interview and see more than a dozen candidates in the waiting area, I just turn around and walk out. It's always either a door-to-door sales job paid only on commission, an MLM scam. Companies should just be honest about what they are. Story 24. My first ever job was delivering phone books from the back of a van when I was 13 years old. The setup was simple. I'd grab books from the van and walk them to people's letterboxes while an older guy drove slowly down the street. At one point, after we finished deliveries in one area, he aggressively sped off to the next neighborhood. Since the van had no seats in the back, I lost my balance and fell. As I tried to steady myself, my hand landed on a broken radio antenna, razor sharp at the break. It sliced my palm wide open, a 4-inch gash. It was gruesome. I yelled at him to pull over because I needed help. He glanced at my bleeding hand, tossed me a plastic grocery bag, and told me to wrap it up. Then he just kept delivering phone books. At least he did the rest of the work himself, I guess. I should have been taken to a hospital, or at the very least brought home to my parents. Instead, I sat there with my hand wrapped in a plastic bag, bleeding. I never showed up again. My parents were furious. Story 25. Back in the mid-90s, I answered a newspaper ad for what seemed like an office job making sales calls. I did a phone interview, and they invited me for an in-person interview. When I arrived, they led me into a room full of about 50 other people, all equally confused. Then someone stepped onto a small stage at the front and announced that we had been selected for the opportunity to sell Cutco knives. Me and 2/3 of the room immediately stood up and walked out. Story 26. I started my first day at an Italian restaurant and immediately got 3 red flags. The manager promised plenty of hours, but every other employee said they were struggling to get shifts and had no idea why they hired me. Everyone, staff, and even some customers said the manager was a jerk. It was my first day, yet I had to teach the person training me how to do a couple of things. It didn't take me long to realize this wasn't the place for me. Story 27. I took a job at Dairy Queen, where they paid a lower training wage. On the first day, they made it clear we weren't allowed to take breaks. The next day, I got a job at Wendy's, where they paid minimum wage and actually let employees take their breaks. So I quit Dairy Queen after just 1 shift. Story 28. I worked as a cashier at a craft store, but quit when I moved. A few years later, I went back for some extra cash, this time in the framing department. During my interview, I explicitly said I would not take full cashier shifts. They swore up and down that I'd only be a backup cashier. First shift after the interview, my schedule said framing, but they put me on cash anyway. Then they told me that actually most of my shifts would be cashiering because they found someone else for framing. I spent my entire 6-hour shift giving every single customer 20% off their total. Then I never went back. Story 29. I applied for a job at my longtime favorite restaurant. I had celebrated my birthday there every year. The owner asked me to come in for a trial shift since I was considering other job offers. I agreed, figuring it'd help me decide. At first, they just had me wash dishes for an hour, no problem. But then their scheduled dishwasher didn't show up, and the kitchen manager asked if I could stay for the lunch rush. He said I'd be paid for my hours. I agreed. The kitchen staff was nice, and I was happy to help. At the end of my shift, I filled out a time card, told the manager I'd likely be taking a different job, and he thanked me for helping out. Fast forward a couple of weeks, I ask about picking up my paycheck. The manager tells me to email the owner. I do, and she basically tells me over text. She claimed it was staging and that I had agreed to work for free. I reminded her that I had stayed an extra 3 hours after the initial trial hour and was explicitly told I'd be paid. She stopped responding. At that point, I decided I wanted to be petty. I contacted the state labor department. They investigated, and she was forced to pay me for all my hours, including the staging hour. A couple of weeks later, I got my $40. Never set foot in that place again. That restaurant closed down a few weeks after I got my paycheck. The owner wrote a long-winded post on Facebook about how the food culture had changed and the city no longer appreciated their restaurant. Total bulls. They were always popular. People just got tired of the awful management. Story 30, I answered an ad for a babysitting job. I already had a casual job, but it was sporadic, so extra cash sounded good. The couple, both in the military, sat me down and explained the real job. I wouldn't just be babysitting. They expected me to live in their house, care for their 6-month-old, and do all the housework. I would get 1 day off every 2 weeks. Oh, and they couldn't actually afford to pay me enough, so they suggested I illegally collect unemployment benefits to make up the difference. I walked out on the spot. They didn't want a babysitter. They wanted a live-in maid and nanny they couldn't afford and expected me to break the law to make it work. Story 31. My uncle and aunt own a car repair shop. When I visited them, I realized that about 80% of their day was spent sitting on the couch, watching security camera feeds on their iPad. Every so often, they'd call their son, who managed the shop, to yell at him because someone hadn't done something exactly right. I can't imagine owning a business and spending all day just babysitting it remotely. Story 32. I got a job at a Build-A-Bear knockoff in a quiet part of the mall. During my interview, the owners, an older couple, mentioned they originally wanted to open a Chick-fil-A but didn't have the $1 million required to do so. On my first day, there was only one other employee working. She barely spoke to me and then disappeared into the back, leaving me alone at the register under a giant decorative mushroom. A mother and her young son came in to browse the bearskin options. I greeted them and let them look around, but they left after a few minutes. Suddenly, my coworker reappeared and handed me the cordless phone. It was my boss. He told me that when a customer enters, he expects me to come out from the mushroom. I later learned they had cameras in the store and spent their time watching employees from home, frequently calling in with demands. I didn't go back after that. Story 33. I took a job unloading shipping containers and was told they had to be emptied by midday because another one was arriving in the afternoon. It was a tough 2-person job, even if both workers pushed themselves hard. Then the boss casually dropped, "Oh, by the way, your partner is off today, so you'll need to handle it alone." I just walked out. Even if this was some kind of trial by fire, I had no interest in working for these people. No thanks. Story 34. Not me, but I was training a new lifeguard once. After our shift, we had mandatory staff training where we practiced rescues. The moment she found out she'd have to actually get in the water and train, she just walked out. I have no idea what kind of job she thought she signed up for. Story 35. Did we work at the same restaurant? I got hired at a failing Italian place that barely had any customers. They had 5 servers scheduled for lunch, even though there were maybe 3 tables total. The owner claimed they desperately needed workers and promised me full-time hours. Technically, I did work full-time, but with no tables, I only made the $3 an hour base pay. And this wasn't the kind of place that made up the difference when I didn't reach minimum wage. Story 36. Years ago, I worked at a restaurant that cut my hours down to just a few shifts on Friday and Saturday nights. So I told them I was coming in and then ghosted. I knew how they operated, and it left the manager completely overwhelmed on their busiest night. It was absolutely worth it. Story 37. I once had a job selling home security systems door to door. The whole approach was to make it seem like a beneficial service while locking customers into 5-year contracts. One day, my supervisor and I visited a home where the family spoke little English. The father mentioned they were already having financial difficulties, yet my supervisor kept pressuring them. It was clear the man didn't fully understand what he was agreeing to. I couldn't bring myself to take advantage of people who were already struggling and put them in an even worse situation. Story 38. When I was younger and more naive, a woman with a horse farm told me it was a working interview. She had me shoveling manure and doing other chores for hours. I was too desperate to realize what was happening. The next day, I sat by the phone waiting for a call that never came. When I finally told my mom about it, she explained that some people are just out to take advantage of others. Story 39. I got a job at a fast food chain when I was 17. During training, I found out the place had been robbed 3 times in the past month, and one employee had been seriously injured, not worth $5 an hour. This was in Georgia in 2004, where minimum wage was still very low. Story 40. I worked at a place where the owners constantly watched the security cameras and called in to micromanage. I just dealt with it, but 2 of my coworkers eventually had enough and walked out. I've shared this before, but I used to work at a sushi restaurant where one of the sushi chefs, Mac, had been there for a while. He was a great guy, and we got along well. His girlfriend also worked there as a cashier, and they were often scheduled together. One Saturday, I was supposed to be off, but I got a call from Carol, the awful boss, asking if I could come in. Apparently, Mac and his girlfriend had finally had enough of her and just walked out in the middle of a shift, leaving the restaurant short-staffed. It was a small place, so aside from the cooks in the back, who barely spoke English, there was only the sushi chef and the cashier. When they left, they pretty much abandoned the restaurant. I took the shift for the extra money, and when I arrived, Carol was already behind the sushi prep counter, trying to keep up with orders. Normally, she never worked weekends, but she monitored the security cameras from home. If she saw anyone standing around, she'd call and yell at them. That's exactly what she had done to Mac and his girlfriend that day, and they finally snapped. Carol even showed me the footage, Mac yelling at her over the phone, hanging up, taking off his apron, and then both of them flipping off the security camera before walking out. She was furious, saying she couldn't believe how unprofessional they were. Personally, I thought it was badass. I had wanted to quit plenty of times, but as a broke college student, I needed the paycheck. Last I heard, they both got hired at a competing sushi restaurant. Story 41. I had 2 interviews for a housekeeping job at a hospital. The night of my second interview, I got a call at midnight from the hiring manager. He said, "I was just so excited I wanted to call and tell you that I'll be calling tomorrow to offer you the job." That should have been my first red flag, but I needed the work. On my first day of training, he had printed out pages from my Facebook account and my boyfriend's. He started asking how long we'd been together and made it clear he already knew everything, so I shouldn't lie to him. It was beyond uncomfortable. After a morning of training, we took a lunch break, and he sat with me in the cafeteria. He asked how I was settling in, then casually told me he expected to see me at his church on Sunday. I hadn't been to church in over a decade. Later, during a quick staff meeting, I waited until everyone left, then quietly placed my badge, keys, and walkie-talkie on his desk and walked out. I felt bad for leaving like that, but it was no surprise they had trouble keeping employees. He called me for months afterward, demanding answers, saying he was worried and deserved an explanation. But I had already called HR the day after I quit to explain everything, so he had no reason to keep contacting me. Story 42. I'm always amazed by employers who expect workers to give their all for barely any hours. My favorite job was at a mom and pop shop that paid above minimum wage and let employees keep all their tips. They also made it clear they never expected us to work only for them. They mainly ran the place themselves, but needed an extra person on weekends and occasionally during the week when they had errands to run. They were flexible, worked around our main jobs, and actually treated employees with respect. Story 43. I was hired full-time, interviewed for full-time. I was desperate to quit a terrible job and needed this one to cover my expenses, especially since it was on the other side of town and required an expensive bus pass. On my first day, everything seemed fine until my manager called me into his office. He explained they had hired too many people and would have to cut my hours down to 15 per week. I told him, painfully, that I had to commute an hour each way, and at 15 hours a week, I wouldn't be able to afford rent or food. His response: "You can always stick around and hope other people quit." I told him he could start with me, took off my apron, and walked out in tears. Story 44. I wasn't the one who quit, but I was training a new guy at a movie theater. A customer politely asked for extra butter. She wasn't rude or demanding, just a normal, easy customer. The guy put the popcorn tub down, said, "I'm going to the bathroom," took off his apron, walked out the front door, and never came back. Story 45. My brother got fired on his third day at a retail job. The official reason? He wasn't upselling enough at the register. The real reason? He shit his pants at work and had to go home early. If you get fired on your second day on the register for not pushing credit cards and you shit your pants the day before, you got fired for shitting your pants. Story 46. In 2006, I got hired at a small, independent insurance agency. On my first day, the owner, who was ancient, announced that email and fax were strictly forbidden. He only believed in-person, phone, or mailed communication. I left for lunch and never came back. I couldn't imagine the inefficiency I'd have dealt with if I had stayed. They eventually went out of business, so I made the right call. Story 47. 2 jobs I walked out on. Got hired for a telemarketing job. Didn't realize it meant auto-dialing people during dinner and pushing products they didn't want. After an hour, I walked up to the manager, apologized, and quit. Attended a Make Easy Money seminar. It turned out to be selling knives door to door. Not sure if that counts as quitting or just noping out. Story 48. I got hired as a waitress at a new diner. The owner didn't have me sign any paperwork. Everything was under the table. That wasn't the problem. The problem was how he moved me around. Instead of calling my name, he'd grab my skirt near my upper thigh and pull me like a leash. Need me in the kitchen? Yank. Need me at the register? Yank. Customers were visibly uncomfortable. One couple left me an almost 50% tip, probably out of pity. I called that night and said I wouldn't be coming back. A few days later, I dropped off my apron, and the guy pulled out a wad of cash from his pocket to pay me on the spot. God, he was creepy. Quitting was the right move. Story 49. I landed what was supposed to be a prestigious political internship, complete with a security clearance. At orientation, I found out the part-time internship was actually 40 to 60 hours a week, unpaid. Worse, no former interns had ever landed a job there, nor did it provide any real advantage for other federal positions. Our responsibilities: facilitating meetings with heads of state, coordinating conferences, and assisting employees with published research without receiving any credit. They were clearly drinking their own Kool-Aid, so I walked right out. Story 50. I got hired at a tiny knockoff dollar store in an old, failing mall. The owner had a thick accent and told me I'd be making $6 an hour, but conveniently left out that it was under the table. I spent about an hour stocking the overly cluttered shelves before he asked me to grab more chips from the back storage area. I walked in and immediately regretted it. Crammed into a tiny back room, sitting on boxes, were at least a dozen men. The second I stepped inside, they all stopped talking and glared at me. I awkwardly asked where the chips were. They started speaking in another language, motioning towards me as they talked. Then one guy stood up and asked what I needed. I told him, and he grabbed a box from the pile and handed it to me. The entire time, every single one of them was staring at me. The whole situation felt beyond shady. Later, I had to use the restroom, which was also in the back. As I walked by, they all just silently glared at me. While I was in the restroom, someone tried to open the door. I was the only woman there. Then the owner told me he wanted me to come back late at night, long after the mall had closed. Yeah, I didn't show up. The next morning, I came in and made up some excuse about why I couldn't work there. He still paid me for the few hours I worked. To this day, I have no idea what was going on back there, and I didn't want to find out. Story 51. I worked a seasonal floor position at Forever 21 once. The store was always a mess, and they rearranged it every week, so nobody knew where anything went. At some point, I just gave up and started grouping things together that looked vaguely similar, because it was all going to get shuffled around again in an hour anyway. Then I got the flu. When I called in sick, They told me that if I didn't get a doctor's note, I'd get a red mark in my file. Nah, you don't give me health insurance, and I'm not in kindergarten. A week later, I started working at a better store down the mall. Story 52. Not technically my first day, but my second day. I got hired at Forever 21 as a temporary floor worker for the holiday season. My training started 1 week before Black Friday, so the store was already in complete chaos. On my first day, the floor manager gave us a tour and introduced us to the layout. Then, I was assigned to shadow a veteran employee. Not even 2 hours into my shift, the person I was shadowing got an emergency call and had to leave for a week. I went to another floor manager and explained the situation. Their response? Just do what you can by yourself. You'll be fine. Everyone else is busy. Okay, sure. I tried. If you've ever shopped at Forever 21, you know their women's section is a nightmare, especially during seasonal sales. They have multiple, almost identical items scattered across completely different parts of the store. Example, a white cardigan with 4 buttons might be across the store from a nearly identical white cardigan with 5 buttons. The dressing room employees were supposed to return unpurchased items to the correct section. They were terrible at it. I'd spend forever trying to put things away, only to realize, wait, this isn't even my section. More than half the items I was given weren't even in my area. I did my best. The next day, I walked in and got pulled into the store manager's office. She told me I was too slow on my first shift, and that if I wanted to keep my job, I needed to be way faster. I explained that I had 0 training and didn't even know where half the clothes belonged. Her solution? You should come in on your free time and memorize where everything is. At that point, I just started putting clothes in random places, finished my shift, and never went back.